So that is where the arms race is leading. It's leading to detrimental outcomes for you and I. It's leading to detrimental outcomes for responsible AI.
Hi, I'm Nidhi.
Hi, I'm Aishwarya.
Welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast. Today we're talking to Charitarth Bharti about large language models and generative AI.
In the second part of the conversation with Charitarth, we discuss publicly available data, exemptions under the Data Protection Act, and how training data affects LLMs. We will also discuss the AI arms race and how states around the world are priming themselves to harness the power of AI over the next decade.
I guess I was just wondering about how using different, so usually in an AI context, the training data obviously significantly affects the outcomes that you see. And so I was just generally wondering what kind of trends you're seeing or how we think about how what we put in sort of implicates the kind of results that we get in large language models.
So as we discussed earlier, there's a whole lot of data that's used to train these models. And often this data undergirds how smart, quote unquote, smart these models would be. And what all resources essentially they will have to, draw on, and how many different nodes they'll have, and how many different points of information they can connect and put together and then formulate their response word by word, predicting what's better. So in that sense, a lot depends on the data. So the data could be, as they say, garbage, and then you would have garbage out. So garbage in, garbage out. You put bad data in and you get bad responses in return. That is the basic principle, right? But you could still get garbage out even if there's great data in, because they can hallucinate. And to clarify what I mean by hallucinate, and by that we mean that it could give you some absolute gibberish that is not true and make it seem like it's true. And we were talking about legal briefs earlier, and you should not be doing this for legal briefs. An attorney in New York found that out the hard way, right? So it made up authorities, it made up, absolutely just and presented them like they were very real. It will say things that are untrue. There are ways to fix that as well. There are ways to prompt them properly. So that when we say prompt engineering, it is more of an art than science. It's both. You have to understand how the model works. You have to understand what it will respond to the most and what will get it to give you the best outcome and the best result. In that sense, some research that came out of, say, Johns Hopkins University actually talked about that. It said that you could, in fact, improve the results that you get from an LLM if you ask it your question with just asking you could ground it, right? It's called grounding. You could say, don't cite something, right? You could exclude certain sources and ChatGPT will oblige. And additionally, because it takes semantic cues, you could add according to in your prompt. And what it would do then is start searching it like what is in its training data. It will look at that and start giving you direct responses. So the research said that it's about 5 to 15% improvement in the responses, and you don't get fake responses to the tune of about 5 to 15%, which is a great improvement. So there are all of these little nuances which can get you to be working much better with an LLM, right? And this also harks back to what you were talking about earlier. It'll also probably create jobs in domains that we previously didn't have jobs in. So people who understand this correctly could perhaps do this.
No, I also was just wondering if you had an example of what this might look like, sort of, for example, because a lot of this, at least when I'm listening to you, it sounds like you would have to have some kind of idea about what kind of training data the model is relying on to, say, specifically exclude this aspect or this source or this whatever. I guess I'm just trying to think of what this would look like, where you're trying to refine your responses based on, or at least based on what the folks at Johns Hopkins found.
So what this would look like?
Like an example of essentially how you would go. So in accordance with what, for example, would give you a better outcome for the question that you have?
Let's think about it like this. Instead of making up a response, like it could make up a brief, let's say you could have asked it, according to Westlaw, what are so it could search up that database. And then that's also what's happening in several places where, you have ChatGPT like LLMs, which are the base. Like you could have these LLMs augmented specifically for those organizations which have a huge trove of data that you want to be having the organizational knowledge on your fingertips, right? So you ask them anything and they, scan the entire organizational database and they give you the correct answers, right? You could have those, you could ground, your responses, as I was saying. You could ground the responses that the LLM gives you in certain sources, right? And if you do that according to, that's a prompt engineering. It seems like a very small thing, but and this is something that has been seen consistently across different LLMs as well, as per that research that I was talking about. But otherwise, generally, it also depends by the LLM and how it was specifically trained. So there is an element of understanding that bit as well. Instead of just modifying your words, you have to modify your words according to the kind of cues that the LLM will be more receptive to or not, depending on how it was trained.
So is this sort of related to, for example, what they found in image-based like models, where they ask, for example, something to generate an image in the style of like a particular artist, which I think later they stopped doing. But then you eventually would get a stylistic sort of like result that was similar to like, I guess, what you were going for originally.
Exactly. So you're essentially, by doing that, I think that makes for a good example of what that would have been. I can't speak specifically to how that would have been trained, right? But that sounds like exactly the kind of example, right? Like you're grounding it in the work of a particular person, which has also been scraped as a part of the training data. So you're picking from that bit, and then it's modifying and putting its own touches into it by combining this with other things. So yeah, it's taking other parts of your prompt, infusing that with the kind of base knowledge that it has.
No, I think it's really interesting because you can also sort of see that just these models, they came out earlier this year, they've really evolved since then. Like there's been massive changes. With every change, you've had new risks come up. And you've sort of had new solutions come up to those risks, which has launched even more risks. Seems like a never ending cycle. So we've heard of concerns relating to privacy where databases are now being linked by certain LLM models where they're taking disparate data and they're trying to link the data sets together. You yourself talked about like how there have been like other privacy concerns that have come up. We've talked about how there can be concerns about like how they can write in the style of another thing, how prompt engineering is rising to sort of counter that. What are other technological evolutions that we are currently seeing? Something that's likely to come up in this field that we're not quite looking at, but that maybe we should be looking at?
One of those things I think would be watermarking. Interestingly, so what happens? We talked about garbage in, garbage out. Now think about this. Now, when most of the content out there in the world is content generated by AI, and then that becomes part of the training data set, it's an endless loop of AI talking to itself. You eventually have no distinguishing between what you're training your data on. And that's a major problem. You could be like generating fake stuff, putting it out there, it could pick it up, and then even maybe your according to it would work. And you don't have authentic vision, right? Like you don't have a distinguishing between what's real and what's not, because technically, when you're scraping the data for an LLM, you don't know what is true and what's not true. So that we need a way to distinguish that something is AI generated or not just for your classroom, not just to check if it's cheating or not, right? But also for training future models. Right now, the way that we focused on this, and ChatGPT became problematic for universities, and there was all that talk about, oh my God, we need to figure out if this is made by an AI model, if it's made by an LLM. People had so many problems. Professors would mark them down and say this is written by an LLM. OpenAI released a tool for that, saying that we'll tell you whether this was written by a model or not. And then they were like, oops, sorry. It turns out we can't really tell you. It's a little bit harder than we thought. And then they withdrew the tool. But there's something else that has come out on this. There's something from, I believe, Google. It's called SynthID. It's a watermarking tool, which is now being used to determine whether something was generated by AI itself. And that then gives you something which you can exclude from your training data set when you're trying to train your AI model, which I think is very important, because as we said, garbage in, garbage out. You have something made by AI and then trained on it, you will just keep on furthering that loop, which you don't want as well.
No, that's really interesting because that sounds very dystopian. But also interestingly, I think we tried the tool that's supposed to tell you if something's generated by an AI or not. And we found that for a lot of lawyers, when you're writing in legal language, it keeps flagging you as an AI. So I thought that was really interesting, and clearly the tool
It's
isn't.
because we're quite mechanical. Like code filings are very mechanical. And also we use the same draft for 1500 filings. So like it's like just change the facts a little bit, change the name, prepare the affidavit on the side. And it's just a lot of it is mechanical, unless like you are a very underloaded associate. But because otherwise you're basically like handling 5 drafts that you have to create in a day. So you're going to be quite mechanical. So yeah, if a
Yeah.
student who wrote their essay for a grade is unable to get past that software, I'm sure a lawyer who is creating 5 drafts a day, just changing the facts and changing the names of parties, is not going to manage.
Yeah, clearly, I think we're not the standard of originality that these AIs really consider. And I think that's really interesting. I think just to sort of like close the loop on the technical sort of conversation that we're having, is that I think AI being trained on AI generated data, of course, it sounds really dystopian, but you do have somewhat of an elementary version of this, right? Where AI is used to generate data, and this data can sometimes be used to train AI. And I'm talking about synthetic data here. And there is
Yeah.
like a primary version of this. So is there like a very big distinction here between why synthetic data might be okay to use, but AI training AI is like not okay?
Yeah, so that goes back to privacy concerns in a lot of ways, right? You use a GAN, a generative adversarial network, to produce an entirely different data set. And you can also use it for debiasing the data set. Because as I was saying earlier, like there is a use of having your data unbiased to begin with, because you don't have the option to do that later on. You cannot say like, can you please remove the biases that I forgot to delete from the data? You cannot do that later. It's not an afterthought. Once it's trained, right? So you have to think about these issues beforehand. So whether that contains sensitive data that the person who's querying the system later on can extract from the model by creative prompts, or whether it contains biased data. This is where generative AI can come and help and create the data set for you, that you can then feed into the model and still have the same sort of statistical accuracy you would essentially be using a different data set. So this is very useful. Let's say that when you're using medical information, you don't want that medical information to be getting out, and it can become problematic. And that's where synthetic data helps. It's a privacy enhancing tool, right? A PET, as it's called. And what it does is quite useful in today's day and age for people who are creating these systems and using sensitive data. All of so many fields like financial sector, the medical sector, right? So many of these fields will require the use of synthetic data in so many ways.
I mean, now that you've spoken about privacy, I guess let's dive more deeply into that for a bit. So, often in the larger context of AI development, you'll see this general, I guess, impression that privacy and AI development are opposing forces. Because presumably, privacy is about how you control access to your information and about how it is used and the different ways in which you decide how your information is used, versus like an AI system where, again, in general, the theory is that the more diverse, the more vast your data set is and your training data sets are, the better it is in terms of like developing more, in some cases fair, but also just developing better AI systems. How do you see the relationship between AI development and privacy? And do you see them as necessarily sort of being competing interests that can't coexist?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I don't think that needs to be the case. There is a lot of advancement that's coming with synthetic data, right? And differential privacy, things which can help you train your model without actually sacrificing the privacy of the people, that undergird the data that you're using. So I think there is a lot of promise in this field. There are some, $1 billion startups in this space already. The reason why capital is pumping in this direction is because there is a top-down, mandate for privacy, for AI safety. And I think that is where we need to focus on instead of thinking about it as an intractable problem. If there are voluntary guidelines, sure, it's left up to you, as is the case in the US. But Europe's found that Goldilocks between US and China in a regulation that is trying to balance the two perspectives. This goes back to another problem where a dystopian scenario where we might not be able to reconcile these two domains, privacy and AI. And the reason why that might happen would be the arms race around AI. While these might not be impossible to reconcile, to wrap up the answer to that question, it is something we need to pay a lot of attention to. We need to invest in technologies. We need to sandbox AI before it goes out and is launched into the real world. We need to anticipate problems that we know we cannot see at this point. We have to invest in transparency enhancing technologies. We have to invest in privacy enhancing technologies. So there is a role for government here, a major role. And I think that is our path forward for not having these two forces collide.
Yes, that's really interesting. But now that we have mentioned it, Charitarth, let's talk about the global AI arms race. So I know that a lot of countries are looking into how to develop their own AI systems, how to develop their own LLMs. There is a huge race going around about like the potential of AI, the potential of data that countries have. So we'll start with an easier question. Can you tell us a little bit about how different countries are designing their own AI models? Like how much progress is everybody making?
I think there is a lot of progress being made in the US for sure. I think let's dial this back a little bit. Let's first, talk about their approaches, right? There are different sort of approaches that different jurisdictions have to AI. There are strict regulations in some places. There are pro-innovation approaches in some jurisdictions, and there are voluntary codes in some. Right, the US has a voluntary code of AI ethics, and they're encouraging corporate entities to sign on to it and implement this in their development of AI systems. They also have a blueprint for AI, White House release. That also just kind of outlines the broad principles of what you should keep in mind while you're developing these systems. So those are more pointers than mandates, right? And they're more voluntary than mandatory. So that's one approach. And this is, of course, happening because the US is fearful of what China might be doing on this front, right? Because there is an arms race that's out there. The amount of proficiency you have in these AI systems, your dominance in these sectors will also translate into your dominance in so many others. China's scared that the US might have supremacy there, and they're right to be scared because they can use a whole lot of data that China cannot, and they have to worry about a whole lot less because you can say anything in the US as an LLM, as a chatbot. In China, you have a political line and then you have to stick to it. So they couldn't do as much. The chatbot race between them was incredibly interesting to watch. China had a disadvantage there, but they were going with it. The US is obviously, as I said, voluntary, and between them somewhere is EU in its Goldilocks zone. And now China is also regulating. It's not to say that China is not regulating. China is regulating with a heavy hand, and it's also doing a whole lot of things which are also scary. There's a digital Silk Road initiative in China, which is supplying these technologies, which could also be facial recognition, to several other countries, which could promote authoritarian regimes and the use of AI by authoritarian regimes for nefarious purposes in those places. And then between these two poles, heavy hand regulation in China, very voluntary code in the US, both of them trying to compete. There is the EU saying, here's a regulation. We're constantly evolving that regulation to also see risks. And we are imbibing the principles of responsible AI in it, and so on and so forth. And then Sam Altman goes and says, what, we'll withdraw you. We will withdraw ChatGPT from Europe. So, and then he takes that back because there's incredible backlash. But that gives you an idea that what happens when you regulate too hard. And this connects with the AI arms race, because if you don't regulate, maybe, and that's what the UK is trying to do, pro-innovation approach in some ways, right? So if you don't regulate, there'll be more investment here. And if you don't regulate, there'll be more investment here. And if you regulate, the investment might go away into areas which are, not very different from tax havens, except they're AI havens, and you can do whatever with the data there. So that is where the arms race is leading. It's leading to detrimental outcomes for you and I. It's leading to detrimental outcomes for responsible AI. Digital rights right now are suffering at the hands of the arms race, which is where the problem is.
I actually have a more sort of basic question. When you talk about the AI arms race in the context of LLMs, like large language models, what exactly are we talking about? Like, what are the risks? What are the arms? Like, what are we racing towards in this context?
Commercial success, for one, right? Everybody's using LLMs. They're going to be used for several different things. They're not going to be used for one thing. So LLMs will be useful in places that we aren't anticipating yet. Right now, we're looking at generative AI. We are going to be converting this, and there is a founder who recently talked about this. We're going to be converting this into interactive AI, and this is going to form the base of that, right? Whoever wins this race, this chatbot race that everybody is trying to get to, will have implications for several other sectors. The productivity that increase that you will see, your economy could just springboard from here with AI in a much different fashion as opposed to a country which does not have any such systems. And because they cannot indigenously develop that, these poorer countries, right? These underdeveloped countries, uh, they eventually will gravitate to the soft power that the country that actually has these systems will be. Will that be US? Will that be China? So that's the question. I hope it's Europe, and I hope it's Brussels effect. So
But there's another question that sort of comes up from this. Is that there's an understanding that when you have a race, people generally start at the same place. And in this case, that's not true because one of the biggest problems with the large language models is the language bit of it. So most of the countries in the global south, all of the countries that are not using English as their primary language, many of them with different scripts, by the very nature of like sort of model that they have to build, the number of languages that you have in your country sort of get left behind. So in that sense, I think what is your sense on that? Like there'll be a lot of countries that'll be left behind just because of the nature of the way this AI is being designed. So how do you think the deployment and design of these AI systems will work out in those countries?
yeah, poorly, because they're not attuned to those social contexts, right? It's it's like most of the content that you're scraping to train LLM models right now is probably in a few languages, right? It does not include these languages at all. It will not include concepts that are very specific to these languages. You will miss out on so many of these things. And again, as you said, they don't start from the same place. They don't have as much content on the internet, which is where all the data is being scraped from. So if you don't have that content up, there's not enough interaction in your language. Google did not create a very good script very early on for your language, so you don't actually enough of a critical mass of content for it to be able to generate enough responses in your language. It's just not trained well enough in your language. That becomes a huge problem, because if you were lagging behind because the internet did not have enough forums or enough areas where you could converse in your language, or there weren't enough speakers with enough internet access, now that's going to just quadruple or go much further than that, because there is no way that you will now start building content to be then training these AI systems. Where you are now is where it picks up from, and the pace at which this technology is developing, you might have already missed the bus. And I don't know what solutions there will be to this, apart from more voluntary commitments that, okay, we will include more languages, we will train more content on it. But if there is no data out there, there's not enough data out there in those languages, then, and if you have limited resources that you can only take in X amount of data and process that amount of data, and already creating an LLM is so expensive, organizations will inevitably overlook sectors, places, languages, people who will not fetch them enough in terms of returns on investment.
So I guess trying to figure out how to align some of those corporate motives with like a broader like language basis is potentially something for us to consider. That's something we see a lot in the moderation kind of space on social media anyway, because like right now you have, for example, Meta committing to increase their moderation efforts in a bunch of different regional languages, for example, in India and other countries. I guess the extent to which that's possible through automation, my understanding is that it's not very good without human moderation at all. And so clearly we're not gonna maybe catch up to English anytime soon, at least. One of the things you were talking about earlier about, the kinds of things that about AI development should give us pause was reminding me about this conversation that we recently had about the AI moratorium. So everyone just sort of commits to not using, but not developing AI for until we figure out basically how we should deal with it. So I was just curious
Yeah.
about whether you had how you thought about like any kind of moratorium on the development of AI.
I mean, a lot of people said that was just a way for those who hadn't woken up early enough to this, technology to get a pause and then work on the sides and just catch up, right? In every industry that you see, there is always a first mover advantage, right? And for a lot of the people who had that first mover advantage, this can be just directly disadvantageous in the sense that just because you didn't get up to the task earlier uh, doesn't mean you stop us. And on the other hand, then there's the risk of extinction, the larger risks that people are talking about, that we need to get this right and we need to stop development till we actually get this right. I don't see that as practical. I wish that were the case. I wish we could just pause economic development for a while and just wait for nature to heal. It took a pandemic to do that, and we suddenly saw around us, so much was different. Like the air was cleaner, the rivers were cleaner, only because economic activity had to grind to a halt. I don't think voluntarily it's going to be the case that anybody's going to stop doing that. Whether the moratorium will work out, I think a lot of people were opposed to it. It obviously did not work out. We're still developing AI at breakneck speed. Uh, that's all as expected. But can we highlight the gravity of these risks to everybody? Because at this point, I think there's a lot of virtue signaling as well. There's so much that's happening in the shorter term that we need to focus on instead of bigger risks to AI systems. Oh, there's going to be extinction risk. Oh, there's going to be automated robots, killer robots. Oh, there's going to be Skynet, soon enough. No, there's going to be bias first. Somebody will not get a loan, right? And somebody will have a life that just didn't pick up the way that it could because that person did not have the chance to start a business. There'll be extra policing in areas which are racialized. There will be facial recognition. There will be surveillance fears. So the risks are much more real, much more closer.
So I think I'm going to round off this conversation with just a simple question. We've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about LLMs, how they work, how they're developing, what the future of that will look like, and what the risks are. So, given all of this, do you think it's possible to have like a good generative AI? Like, it's possible to design a good generative AI that wouldn't have these problems and that you could potentially sort of implement and wouldn't come with all of these drawbacks and all of these problems?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. These are driven by people and organizations which have a say in how they build them and what they do with it. So I definitely think it is possible. And you can see this in terms of the different approaches you're seeing in the sector as well. There is ChatGPT, which is probably the most renowned of LLMs at the moment. But there is also a spectrum of models which are more open, more transparent, more easily embedded into systems that somebody else creates and then wants to use an LLM. That kind of tells you that there's a scope and a possibility of building these differently. And that's where the principles of responsible AI come in. There is a lot that is happening in models which are smaller, relatively much smaller than the ones like ChatGPT and Llama, where they're being released as more open and transparent models. Llama claims, Llama and Llama 2 released by Meta are claimed as open source models, right? But there's a lot of caveats against that as well, right? It's not releasing information about the data set that it used to train Llama 2, and you cannot guarantee that it did not include copyrighted works, which is something which now EUAI Act is also weighing in on. Once it comes in, we'll see how this plays out and how better they made, because it also requires provenance of the data, and you declare that there's copyrighted data involved in it or not. And they're not talking about whether it includes personal data, who it's collected from, right? So that transparency, they're not releasing the weights, right? Those are key things that they're not actually telling you, but it is much more open source than, say, some of the other models. There is obviously, that shows possibility and capability to have this done in a much better way. And as I was talking about the responsible AI principles, the fairness, reliability, accuracy, trustworthiness, all of these principles, privacy, right? Like all of these principles, if you keep these in mind, the outcomes of building a generative AI or any other sort of AI responsibly are very much possible. And that's what a lot of activists in this domain are railing against. They're saying, we know how to make good AI. We know how to actually do this right. But what's driving us away from this goal is, something like the urgency of doing it, of launching it so quickly. Now, Google obviously had this in the pipeline for very long. They've been looking at AI quite seriously as well for quite a bit of time. But as soon as ChatGPT came out, there was an urgency for Google to release something else as well. And they came up and they did a grand event, launched Google Bard, and then had the valuations tank about $100 million, because on stage, there was something false that was basically written on screen. I think it was something to do with the solar system. I can't recall exactly what the fact was that was wrong, but it was hilarious to some people, but it was also scary because they released it in such a rush. Somebody even forgot to check what was on the big screen behind, so they could check. So it's scary. This is where we are kind of lacking the will. There's a massive urgency. Be the first one or the first few ones out there, capture market share, because we live and work in a model where there's walled gardens. So before the garden gets completely walled, get in there. That is scary. We know how to make them good. We have a list. We have a very big list of responsible AI declarations and principles out there now, right? Chief amongst them being the OECD AI principles. And every country has its strategy, which incorporates them. Almost every other country does now. We know all of that. We just have to act on it. How that's going to happen, I don't know. That's going to happen by way of things like these podcasts, maybe.
Very low bar for our podcast. The Google
Very
answer,
high
I think,
bar.
was about.
I think there's going to be like,
that was a joke, but yeah. No, so I think the answer that the question that Google Bard got wrong was about what discoveries from James Webb someone can tell their 9-year-old about, and I think it said that
right.
one of the answers was that this took one of the first pictures of planet outside our own solar system, which
Right.
is not true. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us, Charitarth. I think we could easily have spoken about this for like multiple hours at this point, considering just the various different ways in which this conversation could have gone. But thanks so much for agreeing to come speak at the
Thank
podcast.
you for having me.
Well,
this was a lot of fun.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.